Welcome to Part 3 of Murder and Marriage. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 7. Suspicion. Stephanie arrived promptly, which brought a pleased expression to Coroner Penfield's face, quickly shifting into admiration. She had put considerable effort into her appearance, and just 5 minutes earlier, her mirror had confirmed that her efforts were well rewarded. Her name had appeared in too many social circles for the reporters to overlook, and they all gave her their full attention. "What is your relationship to Miss Brandi Norby, Miss Hull?" Penfield asked, after she had fielded several inquiries. "We're second cousins," she answered, though her voice was soft and difficult to hear. Curtis shifted his chair closer to the center table. "My father, Colonel Julian Hull of Washington, was a first cousin of John Norby, and," she added, her tone becoming more serious, "his lifelong friend." Penfield glanced at his notes. "Mr. Jackson testified, Miss Hull, that you were a witness to the signing of the prenuptial agreement benefiting Miss Norby and Dr. Curtis, as well as the codicil to Norby's will." "Not the codicil," she interjected quickly. "Only the agreement. As Mr. Jackson pointed out, I couldn't witness a document that would benefit me." "Ah, so you were aware of the contents of the codicil last night," Penfield exclaimed, and Stephanie flushed. "What does that have to do with you?" she retorted, her voice rising to a sharper pitch than usual. Penfield responded to her question with another. "What happened to the codicil and the agreement?" he asked. Stephanie raised her eyebrows. "How would I know?" she shrugged. "The last I saw of them, they were on Cousin John's bed." Penfield studied her closely. "Mr. Jackson also mentioned that as you were leaving, Mr. Norby called you back. Please tell the jury what he said to you." "It was a private conversation," she began sharply. "It had nothing to do—" "We are in the best position to determine that," Penfield interrupted. "From the evidence presented this afternoon, you are the last person confirmed to have seen your cousin alive." Stephanie paled. "Thus, the conversation you had with him, no matter how insignificant it may seem, could be relevant to the tragedy and might help the police uncover the mystery of his death." "I assure you," Stephanie whispered, lowering her voice so Curtis leaned in closer to catch her words, "we spoke only about my cousin Brandi and her upcoming marriage. I'm very straightforward." Her beautiful eyes sparkled with intensity, and color rose in her cheeks. "I told Cousin John I thought it was despicable of him," till she hesitated, faltering for a moment before adding weakly, "to use Brandi for his own purposes." "And what were his purposes?" Penfield asked quickly. I was just speaking figuratively." The flush on Stephanie's face drained, leaving her looking pale. "I was angry and didn't choose my words wisely." Penfield regarded her quietly. "So we take it that you had no knowledge of Mr. Norby's so-called plans?" he asked dryly. "Yes." Penfield stroked his chin pensively. "What was Mr. Norby's response to you?" he inquired moments later. Again, Stephanie flushed. "He told me to keep quiet," she replied. At the edge of bitterness in her voice, Curtis' lips twitched. "And then I went to bed." "Did you hear any sounds in the house during the night?" Penfield asked. "No." Her curt response earned a sharp glance from Penfield, though he simply nodded and gestured for her to be excused as he said, "Thank you, Miss Hull." As Stephanie left the witness stand, she hesitated upon seeing Curtis. With a quick nod of her head that he didn't notice, she hurried out of the library, aware that a few reporters were making their way toward her for an interview. "Inspector Cowser from the Central Office will be the next witness," Penfield announced, prompting a stir of interest as the familiar police official stepped up to the center table. The coroner's questions were direct and concise. "Have you conducted a thorough search for the 2 documents signed by John Norby last night, which Mr. Jackson and Miss Hull last saw on his bed?" Penfield inquired a few moments later. "I have, sir, but I found no trace of them," Cowser replied. "Did you uncover any signs of a burglary that might have occurred last night or early this morning?" No, sir. Penfield shuffled through his papers until he found the one he sought. Upon examining John Norby's body in the hall this morning, did you find the weapon that caused the wound in his throat? He asked. Cowser shook his head. We've searched everywhere, but we can't find any weapon at all, he said. It's not in his bedroom, where the bloodstains suggest the wound was inflicted, nor is it next to the body, or along the hall where he staggered before collapsing at the staircase. Penfield set down his pencil. Did you examine the body when you arrived? He asked. I did, sir. Cowser paused and pulled an envelope from his pocket. Mr. Norby was only dressed in his pajamas and was barefoot. There was nothing remarkable about the pajamas, except that the jacket was unbuttoned at the throat and chest. Caught around the second button, I discovered some hairs. Cowser leaned over the table, carefully shaking the hairs onto a piece of paper. Penfield and the jury members leaned forward for a closer look. Cowser savored the interest he had generated for a moment before adding, the hairs are from a woman's head and are chestnut in color. Curtis, who had listened to Cowser with rapt attention, jumped to his feet. The few hairs he had collected from that very button were white. What did Inspector Cowser mean by claiming the hairs were chestnut? He stepped forward but stopped suddenly, struck by a thought. He had asked Teoscar about the color of the hairs, and the Filipino had said they were white. What if the young man had lied, and they were actually chestnut? To be blind, Curtis bit his lip to suppress a groan. A moment later, he regained control over his feelings of helplessness. The question of color could easily be resolved by handing what he had to Coroner Penfield. He pulled out his leather wallet and opened it. His search through its various compartments yielded nothing. The hairs were not there. In a daze, he returned to his seat and focused once more on the proceedings, just in time to hear Penfield address the next witness. Dr. Mayo, please inform the jury of the autopsy results, he instructed. The deputy coroner held up an anatomical chart and traced a red line to illustrate his explanation. Norby died from a wound inflicted to his throat, he stated. The larynx was severed, and one of the major vessels was cut. This wound, he spoke slowly and deliberately, could not have been self-inflicted. A heavy silence followed his statement. The reporters sat with their pencils poised, their eyes fixed intently on the unfolding scene before them. Curtis had pulled his chair closer to the table, leaning forward and resting his weight on his cane. Dr. Mayo, Penfield spoke clearly, do you believe John Norby was murdered? Yes, sir, the autopsy confirms that, Mayo replied, pausing slightly. If you seek more evidence, the lack of a weapon serves as further proof. Thank you, Doctor. The deputy coroner had turned to return to his seat when Penfield stopped him. Please inform Miss Brandi Norby that we need her here immediately. The minutes dragged on painfully for Curtis as they waited for Dr. Mayo's return. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the folding doors pushing open, and Curtis heard light footsteps follow Dr. Mayo's heavier strides as they crossed the room toward the center table. Brandi paused by the empty witness chair. You called for me, she asked, glancing curiously at Coroner Penfield. Yes, Miss Norby. One moment, please, he said as she was about to sit down. Dr. Mayo will administer the oath. Brandi's clear, steady voice echoed as she recited the solemn words, causing Curtis to relax slightly. There was no hint of hysteria in her tone, the kind he worried might manifest after the strain she had faced. Again, he yearned for sight, wanting to picture the scene, to catch a glimpse of Brandi, and wishing for the chance to help her if she needed it. Surely his blindness hadn't robbed him of the ability to support a woman in need. Miss Norby, Penfield's typically gruff voice softened as he studied her face. Dressed in white, her slim figure radiated youth. She had an air of elegance, and her small, shapely head, framed by beautiful chestnut hair, and the unexpected color brought forth by her newfound prominence, revealed a striking beauty of a remarkable kind. Her somewhat foreign yet utterly charming demeanor, along with her striking blue eyes, stood in stark contrast to the cold, disdainful look directed at her. Penfield hesitated, his words shifting on his tongue. He hadn't expected to find such poise in someone so young. Miss Norby, he started again, Have you seen your mother in the last 2 hours? No, she responded. As you suggested, we've stayed in our own rooms and haven't spoken to each other. Penfield glanced over his notes before looking at her again. Were you aware that your uncle prepared and signed a prenuptial agreement ensuring you $50,000 a year with Dr. Curtis? A deep blush quickly spread across Brandi's cheeks as her gaze briefly landed on Curtis, who sat across the table. I was told that, she said quietly, though Curtis caught her words. Who informed you about the document? Penfield asked. Your uncle. Brandi shook her head. No, she spoke with a bit more difficulty. I ran into Mr. Franklin McDermott as he was leaving the house last night, and he mentioned it. And did he also inform you that Mr. Norby signed a codicil to his will, which revoked $1 million bequest to you, and instead left it to your cousin, Miss Stephanie Hull? Brandi nodded again. He did, she replied simply. Miss Norby, Penfield said with weight, where are those documents now? I have no idea, Brandi said, looking at him with serious surprise. Penfield's frustration was obvious. His question hadn't shaken her calm. I assume my uncle put his possessions away safely. They're nowhere to be found, Penfield replied. Until we locate them, Miss Norby, you'll receive the original inheritance of $1 million. He paused for a moment, then added seriously, this means you'll be quite wealthy without needing to marry. Brandi felt a deep blush spread across her cheeks and forehead, but her gaze remained steady on the coroner. You're crossing a line, she said with quiet dignity. My personal matters are not your concern. Penfield flushed slightly beneath his tan. Are you aware that your uncle was murdered? He asked. Murdered, Brandi gasped, staggering in her chair before regaining her composure. Murdered? No, how can that be? The autopsy confirms he was indeed murdered, the coroner repeated. Do you know anyone who might have wanted to harm him? A wave of dizziness washed over Brandi, and she gripped the arms of her chair tightly. No, she stammered, no. Think carefully, Penfield urged, observing her distress with a hint of satisfaction. Was she finally rattled? No, the word came out stronger this time, and Curtis smiled, pleased. She had regained her composure. Shifting his approach, Penfield asked, When did you last see your uncle alive? After dinner last night, she answered, her pause barely noticeable. When did you first discover that he was dead? Brandi stared at him as the silence stretched on. In a swift motion that caught everyone off guard, Coroner Penfield reached across the table and picked up a sheet of paper with a few hairs on it. These, he said, match your hair color, Miss Norby. Brandi gazed at the paper, her expression shifting to one of terror. Where, she struggled to find the words, where did you find them? They were discovered by Inspector Cowser, wrapped around the second button on Mr. Norby's jacket. He paused for effect, then continued smoothly. Inspector Cowser left several hairs around the button, and we saw you skillfully remove them before our eyes when the body was carried past your door on a stretcher. Brandi kept her eyes fixed on his face. The coroner was the first to break the silence. Come now, Miss Norby, why don't you tell us where you were when John Norby was murdered? Brandi opened her mouth twice, but no words came from her dry lips. I, she faltered again, then steeled herself in the quiet. I have nothing to say. For a long minute, Coroner Penfield regarded her steadily. The stillness in the large library felt heavy. Somehow, Curtis found himself standing beside Brandi. Did your hair, Penfield pressed relentlessly, get caught on that jacket button when you leaned in to listen for Norby's heartbeat? Brandi stared blankly at the coroner, stricken. Curtis's commanding voice broke through the tension. Miss Norby has the right to have counsel present, he stated firmly. You are overstepping the authority granted to this inquest, Coroner Penfield. Penfield scowled for a moment, then his expression softened into a smile. The inquest is adjourned until Thursday afternoon, he declared. He stepped forward, blocking the advance of the reporters. Not now, gentlemen. You cannot interview Miss Norby," he added, casting a sidelong glance at the scene near him. "Dr. Curtis will provide you with the name of her attorney." Chapter 8. Hull approached him, concern etched in her features. "I understand, dear. It has affected us all. Perhaps you should take a moment to collect your thoughts." Colonel Hull ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "Collect my thoughts? How can I do that when everything seems to be falling apart?" He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "I feel as if the ground has been ripped from beneath us." "Sit down, Julian," she urged gently. "You can't solve anything by pacing. We must think clearly." With a heavy sigh, he sank back into the chair. "You're right, of course, but I can't help but think of Stephanie. She is alone in all this." "Indeed, but perhaps she needs some space right now. Let her mourn, and in time she will reach out." Colonel Hull shook his head. "I should have been there for her. I should have." His voice trailed off, frustration evident in his furrowed brow. "Julian, you have your own burden to bear. We all do. You can't solve her grief just by being there. We must also think of ourselves." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I suppose you're right. It's just difficult to wait." "Then let's make a plan. We can visit her first thing in the morning. You'll have a chance to speak with her, to support her then." Colonel Hull's posture relaxed a touch. "Yes, a good plan, but I wish I could do something more." Mrs. Hull smiled softly, reaching across the desk to squeeze his hand. "Being there for her when the time is right is significant. Sometimes that is the most we can offer." "Thank you, Claire," he said, meeting her gaze. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Together we will face what comes next," she replied resolutely. "Now let's have dinner. We need to take care of ourselves as well." As they settled into the evening, the weight of their shared loss hung in the air, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength found in unity. Hull set down her embroidery and looked directly at her husband, tears brimming in her eyes. "John Norby was a good man," she said. "A man of honor." She hesitated before adding in a hushed voice, "Stephanie said on the phone that the authorities suspect he was murdered." The news hit him in a way she hadn't expected. Instead of the intense reaction she thought would come, Colonel Hull nodded gravely and fell silent. Mrs. Hull blinked in surprise. She had inherited her striking features and vibrant coloring from her father, along with his propensity for nerves. In contrast, her own stoic demeanor matched her more muted appearance. There was nothing particularly distinctive about Mrs. Hull. She lived a life that mirrored her husband, relying on Stephanie for her sense of style and grace. Her world was limited to her kitchen and household duties. Although she possessed independent means, she had married Julian Hull during a time when he was struggling financially, despite being 5 years younger than her. Defying expectations, their union had turned out quite well. Mrs. Hull had never particularly excelled in social circles, so upon Stephanie's debut, she gladly handed over the reins of entertaining to her talented daughter and retreated to her charities and garden. "Do you realize what I just said, Julian?" she finally asked. "They think your cousin John was murdered." "I heard you the first time," he replied sharply, brushing his hand over his grey mustache. "I am horrified, yes, but hardly surprised." Noticing his wife's shocked expression, he added, "John wasn't the type to take his own life." "But why would anyone want to kill him?" she insisted. "He never hurt anyone." Hull shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's a shocking crime," he said. "Let's hope the killer is caught quickly and faces the justice they deserve. Did Stephanie mention Brandi and her mother?" "Only that Belle was remarkably calm and composed," Mrs. Hull answered. "She didn't mention Brandi." Hull returned to the dining room. She found her husband in good spirits, a stark contrast to the earlier somber mood. "I can understand how difficult it must be for them," she said softly, sitting across from him. "Indeed," Colonel Hull replied, lifting his glass. "But we will bring some comfort to our friends. They need us now more than ever." Her brow knitted with concern. Mrs. Hull hesitated. "Are you sure I should come? You know I'm not fond of emotional scenes." He reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand over hers. "I believe it's important. We'll keep our visit brief." With a resigned nod, Mrs. Hull stood up. "I'll have Jane prepare dinner as soon as she can. You look exhausted, Julian. A good meal will do you wonders." Without waiting for his reply, she disappeared to summon the waitress. Colonel Hull remained seated, lost in thought, until after a few moments he stood and approached the mantel. He picked up a large silver mirror, scrutinizing his reflection with an appraising gaze. "Tired, nonsense," he muttered to himself. "It's just age, and perhaps a few restless spirits." He set the mirror aside, unlocked a lower drawer of his desk, and retrieved a decanter and a glass. The rich cordial rejuvenated him, dispelling some of the weight pressing on his chest. By the time he finished arranging his attire for dinner, he was whistling a cheerful tune. For Mrs. Hull, 8 o'clock arrived far too soon, bringing with it an unease that settled in her stomach. But as Colonel Hull donned his dinner jacket, he seemed to transform, laughter spilling easily from his lips. It had been a long time since she'd seen him so lively. The meal was delicious, and with a reluctant sigh, she left the table to fetch her wrap from her bedroom. It had been 10 years since they had left their old home on Capitol Hill for a more imposing residence on Wyoming Avenue. The move had suited Stephanie well, but Mrs. Hull found little joy in it. Nothing could replace the charm of their old garden and the cozy house, steeped in a sense of history. In her eyes, the bright electric lights and modern conveniences didn't make up for the comfort of a quiet neighborhood free from the incessant noise of automobiles. When Mrs. Hull returned, the ambience had shifted. A deeper connection between them seemed to pulse in the air, binding their shared resolve. Hull entered the reception hall on the ground floor and heard voices coming from a small room off to the side. As she approached, a young man brushed past Colonel Hull and moved to greet her. In the soft glow of the shaded lights, she recognized her husband's junior partner. "Franklin," she exclaimed with delight. "What a surprise to see you here. I thought Stephanie mentioned you were out of town." "I'm just on my way to the train," Franklin McDermott replied. "I stopped by, hoping to find Stephanie home, but the colonel tells me she's still at 10 Acres. "Yes, Cousin Belle asked her to stay longer." "I don't understand why Belle feels the need to play hostess," her husband interrupted. "It seems to have gone to her head more than ever." "She does have a certain authority now." McDermott's smile was tinged with a hint of disdain. John Norby's death was a terrible thing. "But it wasn't a suicide," Mrs. Hull interjected. "Stephanie insists it was murder." As McDermott took a step back, he moved into the glow of a nearby light. Mrs. Hull noticed the pallor of his face and the haggard lines etched there. He flushed noticeably when their eyes met, and to conceal his discomfort, he stroked his fair mustache, which masked the weakness in his mouth. "Murder," he echoed, disbelief lining his voice. "That can't be. John Norby was liked, beloved even." "That's what I told Julian," Mrs. Hull asserted. "Stephanie said it wasn't a burglary. It has to be something else." "Of course it was a burglary." McDermott's firm tone pleased Mrs. Hull, reinforcing her admiration for him. He always seemed to be on her side during family discussions. Quickly, he turned to Colonel Hull. "Did Stephanie mention that John Norby left her $1 million? "Good gracious." "Well, I'll be." The two exclamations brought a smile to McDermott's lips, yet his eyes remained sharp and alert. "Have you seen Stephanie?" he inquired. "No, we're on our way to 10 Acres now," Mrs. Hull replied. Hull spoke as if she were in a trance, while her husband, absorbed in a large silk handkerchief, blew his nose with force. "It's unbelievable that John left such a considerable fortune to Stephanie. I knew he cared for the child, but—" she took a deep breath. "It's beyond comprehension." "Here's your ride," McDermott exclaimed as a taxi wheezed its way to the door and came to a halt. "Let me help you in, Mrs. Hull." He took her gently by the elbow and guided her down the few steps to the driveway, which ran across the sidewalk and led to their front door and the garage at the back of the house. Colonel Hull followed them more slowly, remaining silent until McDermott had draped a light lap robe over his wife's elegant gown. "Will you join us, Franklin?" he asked, 1 foot on the running board. "I'm sure Stephanie and Brandi would be happy to see you." McDermott shook his head. "I can't make it, Colonel, thanks anyway." He partially closed the door. "Speaking of Brandi," his tone shifted, "there's a guy at 10 Acres, David Curtis. Have you met him?" Colonel Hull sank heavily onto the seat next to his wife. "David Curtis," he repeated. "No, I can't say I have. Is he a banker?" "A surgeon and blind, no less." McDermott shrugged. "Brandi is set to marry him. Good night," he said, slamming the door behind him. His farewell received no reply. Both Colonel Hull and his wife were momentarily lost for words. Stephanie was stifling a yawn when Starnes led her parents into the drawing-room at 10 Acres. She genuinely brightened at their arrival. "I hoped you would come," she said, greeting her father with a kiss. "Why didn't you make it for the inquest this afternoon, Dad?" "Couldn't leave the office. McDermott didn't show up. Starks are a bit unpredictable," Colonel Hull replied, his words coming out in a rush as Mrs. Norby approached them. She heard the taxi pull up while she was in her bedroom and paused just long enough to check her reflection in the mirror before heading to the drawing-room. Hull managed to hide his frown as he bowed to the attractive widow. Despite their outward friendship, a deep-seated mistrust simmered between them. "We expected you earlier today, Julian," she remarked. "Didn't Sam Jackson get in touch with you by phone?" "No," Hull settled onto the sofa beside her. "I was told by Central that your phone was disconnected." "It is for outsiders, yes, but we can still make calls from here." She glanced at Stephanie and her mother, then lowered her voice. "Would you like to see John?" Colonel Hull's rosy cheeks turned pale. "No," he replied with excessive fervor, then noticing her surprised look, softened his tone. "I can do no good for the poor lad, and seeing the body would be upsetting. I'd rather remember him as he was the last time I saw him." "And when was that?" a quiet voice interrupted from beside him. Turning around, Hull found himself face to face with a stranger, partly hidden by the wingback chair he occupied. Mrs. Norby watched Hull's surprise with some amusement and broke the silence. "Julian, this is Dr. David Curtis," she introduced. "Dr. Curtis, my cousin, Colonel Julian Hull." Curtis's long, nervous fingers gripped Colonel Hull's flabby hand with a pressure that made Hull wince. Hull managed a greeting and continued to study the blind man before him. Curtis sensed the scrutiny and adjusted his chair to better engage with the group. "I apologize," he said, his voice apologetic. "I thought you were aware of my presence. I've been here talking to Miss Hull while she stepped out to find Mr. Jackson. You mentioned, Colonel Hull, that you'd like to remember John Norby as you last saw him." "When was the last time you saw him?" "What's that to you?" Hull shot back, his tone aggressive. Curtis took a moment to light the cigarette Mrs. Norby, an intrigued listener, had handed him. "Mr. Jackson is acting as Miss Brandi Norby's attorney," Curtis said, speaking slowly and clearly. "He asked me to help him unravel the mystery of John Norby's death." "So you're trying to pin this on me?" Hull interrupted. "Not at all. I simply asked a straightforward question to find out how Norby seemed when you last saw him. If my question was unclear, I hope you won't take offense," Curtis replied. Colonel Hull masked his anger with a forced joviality while mentally noting to settle the score with the surgeon later. "Of course I'll answer any questions you have," he exclaimed with an exaggerated grin. "But you have to admit your question was rather vague, and coming from a total stranger. Well, we can move past that, right, Belle?" he added, casting a quick glance at Mrs. Norby. "What would you like to know?" "When you last saw Norby, was he anxious, or was he acting like himself?" Curtis inquired. "Oh, he was a bit on edge," Hull confessed, trying to sound open. "He came to my office last week, getting worried about stock prices. He had been investing in oil, despite my advice against it." "And that was the last time you saw him?" Curtis pressed, his politeness unwavering. Hull felt his face flush, but before he could answer, he was interrupted. "Dad!" Stephanie tapped him on the shoulder. "Mother!" Waiting in the hall. "She's not feeling well." She turned to Mrs. Norby, who had also stood up. "So don't keep her waiting, Dad." "I'll be there right away." Colonel Hull stepped aside to let Curtis go ahead of him. "I hear, little girl, that John left you quite a fortune." "In a codicil to his will," Mrs. Norby answered for Stephanie, who was a few steps ahead and hadn't heard her father's comment. "Unfortunately, the codicil is missing." Colonel Hull stopped in his tracks and glared at Mrs. Norby. Norby's cheek. She simply nodded before turning away. Norby clenched his fists, frustration boiling within him. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "Are you saying the codicil has been hidden, stolen, if you prefer that term?" He met Mrs. Norby's icy glare with indignation. "Dad," Stephanie interjected, placing a calming hand on his arm. "Please, don't get upset. You'll only worry Mother." Mrs. Hull, anxious and unable to remain still, paused her restless pacing in the square hall as they approached. Stephanie stepped forward, addressing Curtis. "Mother," she began, "this is Dr. David Curtis," then hesitated before adding, "Brandi's fiancé." "It's a pleasure to meet you," replied Curtis, noting Mrs. Hull's awkward demeanor. She was clearly uncomfortable, as he could see just as well as her family members. She shook his hand briefly before dropping it and adjusting her evening cloak around her shoulders. "The taxi is waiting outside," said Colonel Hull, looking to his wife. "Come on, Claire." She hesitated slightly before turning to Mrs. Norby. "When will John be laid to rest?" she asked quietly. "The funeral will be tomorrow morning in the chapel at Oak Hill," Mrs. Norby responded, her tone confirming the somber nature of the occasion. "Only family will be present. I assumed Sam Jackson had informed you of the arrangements. He's handling everything." "I haven't spoken to Sam." Mrs. Hull embraced Stephanie warmly and shook hands with Curtis once more before heading toward the door. "Good night, Doctor. Oh, Belle." Her tone shifted, a hint of sadness creeping in. "It's truly heartbreaking to come here and not find John. He was always so warm, so kind. I recall our last conversation about Julian's future, when he told me I was my husband's guiding star." Mrs. Norby did not respond verbally. She simply pressed a cool kiss to Mrs. Hull's cheek, then turned away, lost in her own thoughts. Hull's cheeks were flushed, and with a quick wave to the colonel, she turned back to Curtis, who was waiting near the library entrance. "Lodestar is fine, but spell it Lode," she remarked sharply, keeping her voice low to avoid the Hull's notice. John certainly had a sense of humor. Curtis smiled. "Are you going upstairs, Mrs. Norby?" he asked. "Yes, and you?" She paused on the lower step. "I'll stay and smoke in the library for a bit. It's only 9 o'clock, he said as the clock chimed the hour. "Good night." "Good night," she echoed, continuing up the staircase. Curtis listened until the sound of her soft footsteps disappeared, then thoughtfully entered the library. The servants had hurriedly returned the furniture to its place after the inquest, making it a bit tricky for Curtis to navigate. "Oh, do be careful," a gentle voice sounded to his right, and a hand brushed against his. "This way. I, her dignity somehow both charming and awkward, am Brandi." "As if it could be anyone else," Curtis said with unexpected warmth, and Brandi laughed shyly before her expression turned serious. "I came downstairs hoping to find you," she explained, her cheeks warming. "When I heard Cousin Claire and Cousin Julian talking in the drawing room, I came in here to wait until they left. I want," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "to talk about Uncle John's plan for our marriage." The last words spilled out, and she fell silent, struggling for words. Curtis stepped in to help her. "I understand," he began seriously. "We'll call the whole thing off." "In other words," he tried to ease her discomfort, "I release you from your promise." She nervously fiddled with her gown. "It's you who don't understand," she said. "I don't want to be released." Curtis lifted his gaze. Had his ears betrayed him? "You mean," he asked slowly, "that you want to continue with the marriage ceremony?" "Yes," her response was little more than a whisper. "But," he hesitated, Now that you seem quite wealthy, isn't it unnecessary to fulfill the bargain your uncle tried to impose on you? She took her time before answering. I gave my word to him, she murmured. I cannot betray the dead. The ticking of the mantel clock filled the silence. Suddenly, she spoke again, her voice trembling. You hesitate. You don't want to marry me, she asked. Heat rushed to his face and then ebbed away. I'm only hesitating for your sake, he replied. If you marry me, you will be bound to a blind man, a failure. She fell silent for a moment. Instead, Curtis heard her step back a few paces, and then the faint click of an electric lamp turning on. Brandi turned to face Curtis, her expression serious under the lamp's glow. Even now, there was not much flesh on her tall, slender frame, but the confidence and grace that once defined her had returned. His face still showed signs of past anguish, but the youthful sadness had faded. Because it's a bargain, Curtis's voice broke through her thoughts. I want it to be a fair one. You're offering me the means to live. I can give you nothing. Perhaps, she interrupted quickly. I seek your friendship, your support. Curtis felt his heart skip a beat and then race ahead. I will do anything for you, he said, slightly unsteady, and I will gladly see your uncle's plan through. Thank God, she whispered. Suddenly, the curtains were pulled back, and Mrs. Norby stood at the entrance, with Jackson behind her. You may go to your room, Brandi, she said in a cold voice. In an instant, the curtains fell back into place, leaving Curtis alone. Chapter 9. 2 pieces of string. David Curtis fumbled through his empty cigarette case and let out a sigh of regret. He hadn't realized how quickly he had smoked them all. The cigarettes had at least provided him some distraction. Ever since Brandi had been summoned by her mother, he had been left utterly alone. No one had entered the library, and the folding doors, used for the inquest in place of the curtains, had been closed by Mrs. Norby after Brandi left, blocking any sounds from the hall. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes with an infuriating steadiness. At 10 o'clock, he set down the box of matches he had been idly spinning in his fingers and picked up his cane. The sound of a door opening drew his attention. Excuse me, sir, Starnes apologized as he stepped further into the room. I didn't realize you were still here. I was thinking of shutting the house for the night. I won't keep you, Curtis responded quickly. I'm heading to bed now. Has everyone else retired? Yes, sir. Starnes busied himself closing one of the long French windows leading onto the veranda and bolting the other 4. Mr. McDermott just returned. Curtis paused at the door. Mr. McDermott, he asked, curious. Mr. Franklin McDermott. Yes, sir. Starnes brushed his hands off dismissively. He told me he missed his train, so he came back to spend the night. Oh, Curtis exclaimed, masking his uncertainty. He caught the barely concealed excitement in the usually placid butler's voice. Where is Mr. McDermott now? He went straight to his old room. He hadn't taken his things with him. Starnes turned off 2 of the tall standing lamps, leaving the room in dim light. He said I need not disturb Mrs. Norby to inform her of his arrival. Is there anything I can do for you, sir? No, thank you. Curtis reached the doorway and turned back. Good night, Starnes. Night, sir. Starnes watched the tall, upright figure walk into the hall, admiration gleaming in his eyes. He's something else, he murmured to himself, then focused on closing up the house. As Curtis approached the staircase, a thought struck him, causing him to pause. Why not have Starnes refill his cigarette case with the stark jar Norby kept for his guests? He turned around, retracing his steps, but halted suddenly. He caught the sound of heavy breathing nearby, followed by light, retreating footsteps. Starnes, he called quietly, but received no answer. After a brief moment, he went back to the staircase and began climbing it slowly, his cane swinging comfortably in his right hand. It was leaded and would serve well as a club if needed. Keeping his left hand on the banister, he navigated around the corner of the staircase, remembering de la Cruz's clear directions to his bedroom. Just as he turned into the corridor, a shout from Sam Jackson stopped him. Hello, Curtis. Jackson kept his usually robust voice low. I'm glad you're still awake. I need to talk to you. You can have more than one if you'd like, Curtis replied. I'm not in a rush. Great, let's head to John's old bedroom, this way. He slipped his arm through Curtis, matching his pace as they walked down the winding corridor. I was on my way to find you. Yes, Curtis asked as his friend led him into the bedroom, switched on the light, and then shut the door to the hall. What can I do for you? The answer came from a surprising source. Go to hell, shouted Ruffles, abruptly awakened by the sudden brightness of the electric light. The parrot hopped around on its perch, flapping its wings right in Jackson's face as he approached. I swear I'll wring that bird's neck one day, he muttered. How John managed to put up with its constant chattering is beyond me. Curtis snapped his fingers and hummed a popular tune. Ruffles' feathers smoothed out, and his irritation faded. He gently nipped at Curtis, outstretched finger, then, with one sleepy eye fixed on Jackson, hopped down to a lower crossbar and settled in for a nap. You seem to have the same gift for charming Ruffles that John had, Jackson remarked, eyeing the parrot with disdain. Come over here, Curtis. He moved a chair aside, and Curtis followed him across the bedroom. He could feel the cooler air flowing in, indicating they were near an open window. I'll close this any moment. No, please don't, Curtis interrupted. The room feels a bit stuffy, and the fresh air is nice. Well, if there's not too much of a draft. Jackson sounded unsure. He was never one for cold air. Take this seat by the desk. I'll sit over here. Moments later, Curtis heard keys jingling against the wood. Jackson noticed his questioning look. I'm checking through John's desk, he explained. Inspector Cowser and Coroner Penfield said they searched it thoroughly, but found nothing. And what are you hoping to find? Curtis asked. The documents John signed last night, Jackson replied quickly. Or at least some clue about where they are now. We couldn't find any trace of them in the bureau or highboy. This, he said, resting his hand on the secretary, is the only other place John could have put the papers. He certainly wouldn't have left them scattered around the room. Maybe he gave them to someone, Curtis suggested, as Jackson inserted a key into the top drawer of the secretary. Jackson twisted and turned the key until the drawer finally unlocked. If John did that, wouldn't that person have come forward by now to hand them over to me or the police? He asked. Assuming that person knows about Norby's death, Curtis added. Jackson turned his head to look at him in disbelief. Not know about his death, he exclaimed. If John did give them to someone, that person is living here now. Remember, no one was allowed in this house after Franklin McDermott left. Curtis tapped his cane thoughtfully. I don't recall the coroner asking if any visitors came to the house after Norby retired to his room, he replied. Maybe not, Jackson shot back. But you know that no one came here because you were in the library longer than anyone, and the library is near the front door. And I am blind, Curtis interjected. Jackson looked startled. I forgot, he mumbled, but your hearing is remarkable. The heavy drapes were drawn, and I sat at the far end of the library near the fireplace, Curtis pointed out. I was also lost in my thoughts. I can't say for certain that no one came in last night. Jackson pulled out the contents of the drawer, examined them, and put them back before he spoke again. It hadn't crossed my mind that someone, an outsider, might have had access to John after we left him, he admitted slowly. Honestly, I've been preoccupied with one thought, that the papers were stolen. By whom? Curtis's calm voice barely concealed the unease that gripped him as he awaited Jackson's response. Jackson carefully sorted through a bundle of papers and placed them back in one of the compartments. By the person who stood to gain from the document's disappearance, he said, and Curtis frowned at the vague answer. And who is that? He pressed. Jackson regarded him intently. You know it as well as I do, he said, his voice rough. It can only be John's niece, Brandi Norby. Curtis bent his cane in his strong grip and then let it snap back into place. Miss Norby requested that you be retained as her lawyer, he replied. As her representative, you should be the last person to cast suspicion her way. As her lawyer, I'm trying to clear her name by locating those cursed documents, Jackson shot back, frustration bubbling over. And listen here, Curtis, he said, turning excitedly toward the blind surgeon. It's going to be seriously bad for her if we don't find them. Don't forget, John was murdered. Good heavens, are you implying? Curtis stood up abruptly, gripping Jackson's arm tightly. No, no, let go, you fool. Jackson struggled to break free. I don't think she killed her uncle, but, he added as Curtis released him, I do believe she took those papers. Curtis worked to steady his temper. What makes you suspect Miss Norby of theft? He demanded, as Jackson took a moment to scrutinize him. Well, he finally replied, with the codicil and the prenuptial agreement gone, Brandi stands to inherit a massive fortune without needing to marry you. And that's your only reason for believing she took the documents, Curtis pressed. Isn't that enough? Jackson retorted, his tone challenging. She wanted to avoid marrying you, and that surely makes her a thief. Really? Curtis rested his cane across his knees and leaned in slightly. Then how do you explain the fact that she's still willing to marry me? Jackson let the loose papers he had pulled from a smaller drawer of the desk slip from his hands. Are you saying that you two are going ahead with Norby's plan? He stammered. You're actually going through with this marriage charade. Curtis nodded, his expression serious. We are, he said. Brandi and I have just made that decision. I'll be forever surprised. Jackson leaned back, staring at his companion in disbelief. It took him a moment to find his voice. Brandi is a lot sharper than I realized. I don't understand what you mean. Well, Jackson paused, reconsidering. Let's see what we can dig out of this desk. He bent down and picked up the papers he had dropped moments before. Receipts, household accounts, he muttered as he scanned them. Wait a minute, what's this? He unfolded a legal-sized sheet. Looks like part of an inventory, furniture and such. Here's a note in the corner, written sloppily in John's handwriting. Contents of safe deposit belong to, that's all, he said, looking back at Curtis with confusion. Well, what does it mean? Asked Curtis, growing more impatient. Oh, nothing. Jackson refolded the paper, neatly stacked the others, and put them back in the drawer, but he slipped the legal-sized sheet with its list of furniture and such into his coat pocket. Put it back, Curtis instructed firmly. Jackson's mouth dropped open, and his hand fell to his side. How? He started, then turned angrily on Curtis. You can see. No, Curtis smiled casually. You simply forgot that kind of paper makes a lot of noise. It didn't take a genius to spot you, but don't try to pull this on me again, Jackson. The lawyer flushed deeply, bit his lip, hesitated, then pulled out the paper and placed it back among the others in the drawer. I took it out on impulse, he said in a defensive tone. I don't know why, except that John's handwriting in that note seemed a bit shaky. Was there room to finish his thought? Jackson retrieved the paper again and offered it to Curtis. Feel here, he said, guiding Curtis, fingers to the lower right corner. What do you notice? That the corner has been cut off diagonally, replied Curtis, running his hand over the sheet. The other corners are intact. Exactly. Jackson crossed his legs comfortably, settling into a more relaxed posture. The note is just above that corner and stretches from edge to edge of the paper. It reads, Contents of the safe deposit box belong to, the name must have been written just below it. And then cut off, Curtis replied, handing back the paper. Put that away, Jackson. The real question is, did Norby cut off the corner himself, or was it someone else? And if so, what was their motive? And what does the contents of the safe deposit box have to do with John's murder and the missing codicil and prenuptial agreement? Jackson asked, his excitement growing. The answer to that will come when we open his safe deposit box, Curtis said dryly. Does Coroner Penfield know about this box? I told him John had a box at the Metropolis Bank, Jackson answered. We've arranged to have it opened in the presence of the Registrar of Wills and the bank officials tomorrow morning. Great! Curtis leaned forward and tucked the inventory sheet into the open drawer before shutting it. Go ahead, Jackson, and check the desk. There's only one drawer left that I haven't looked through, the lawyer said as he opened it, carefully examining its contents. Ah, just invitations, souvenirs, and menus. He slammed the drawer shut. This search has been a bust, Curtis. Curtis pushed back his chair. It seems that way, he admitted, at least in terms of finding the missing documents. Tell me, Jackson, he said as his companion stood up, what was the relationship between John Norby and Franklin McDermott? Well, there isn't one, Jackson replied. McDermott is about 30, I believe. He's a partner with Colonel Hull, which brought him into contact with John occasionally, since Hull's firm handled some financial dealings for John at one point. Is McDermott particularly charming? I think he has quite a way with women, Jackson said, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. He paused at the light switch, ready to turn it off, while Curtis, following him more slowly across the bedroom, prepared to reach the hallway door. John liked him well enough. They always seemed friendly, and he visited often. I can't figure out why McDermott left so abruptly last night, or why he hasn't returned since. McDermott came back just before I came upstairs. He did. Jackson looked at Curtis in silence for a moment before speaking quickly. Have you spoken with him? No. Starnes mentioned his return and that he went straight to his room. Curtis lingered by the open door, and while Jackson turned away to switch off the bedroom lights, he placed his hand on the outer door knob. From it still hung the piece of string that had misled him into thinking he was entering his own room the night before. Coming, Jackson. The lawyer shut the door firmly behind him. I'll walk you to your room, he whispered. It's later than I thought. Their footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet as they walked down the corridor in silence. At the entrance to Curtis's room, Jackson gave him a low good night. Just a moment. Curtis stopped him as he was about to leave. Could I borrow a cigarette? Of course, take these, the lawyer said, shoving a packet into Curtis's hands. No, I don't want any tonight, Jackson added, hurrying away without waiting for Curtis's thanks. The packet had been handed to him upside down, and to Curtis's dismay, the cigarettes tumbled to the floor before he could catch them. Bending down, he fumbled around, and after some effort, retrieved most of them. Just as he was about to stand, he felt a string half hidden at the edge of the carpet lining the corridor. Straightening up, Curtis closed his door, then bent again. The string lay directly beneath the doorknob. He carried it into his bedroom, shut the door, and made his way to a chair. After setting aside his cane, he lit a cigarette and examined the string closely. He estimated it to be about 6 inches long, made of ordinary twine, with one end tied in a loop that had been neatly cut. Curtis held the two ends of the loop together. Its size suggested it could easily fit over his doorknob. Curtis smoked for several minutes without moving, the twine dangling in his left hand, his mind consumed by the mystery of the two strings. Why had Teoscar insisted he hadn't tied a string to his doorknob, a way for Curtis to identify his own bedroom? Why had the string been cut, and most importantly, why was there a string tied to John Norby's doorknob? An hour later, Curtis undressed and went to bed, the mystery still unresolved.